right, today we're going to start reading our book, A Long Way from Chicago. So this is lesson 2 of our reading project. All right, so let's open it up. Hopefully everybody wrote their prediction. We'll now get to see how close you were with your prediction. Now remember, it's a prediction, so it's okay if it's doesn't come out completely correct. All right, prologue. It was always August when we spent a week with our grandma. I was Joey then, not Joe. Joey Dowdle, and my sister was Mary Alice. In our first visits we were still just kids, so we could hardly see her town because of Grandma. She was so big and the town was so small. She was old, too, or so we thought. Old as the hills. And tough. She was tough as an old boot, or so we thought. As the years went by, though, Mary Alice and I grew up, and though Grandma never changed, we'd seem to see a different woman every summer. Now I'm older than Grandma was then, quite a bit older. But as the time gets past me, I seem to remember more and more about those hot summer days and nights, and the last house in town where Grandma lived. And Grandma. Are all my memories true? Every word, and growing truer with the years. Okay. Chapter 1. Shotgun Chetham's Last Night Above Ground, 1929. You wouldn't think we'd have to leave Chicago to see a dead body. We were growing up there back in the bad old days of Al Capone and Bugs Moran. Just the winter before they'd had the St. Valentine's Day massacre over on North Clark Street. The city had such an evil reputation that the Thompson submachine gun was better known as the Chicago typewriter. So obviously they were growing up kind of in the time of gangsters and so it's kind of crazy that they had to leave the big town of Chicago where all these gangsters and all mafia and everything's happening before they actually see a dead body. But I'd grown up to the age of 9 and my sister Mary Alice was 7 and we'd yet to see a stiff. So stiff means a dead person. We guessed that most of them were where you couldn't see them, at the bottom of Lake Michigan, wearing concrete overshoes. That's something that the gangsters would do is if they killed somebody and they didn't want anybody to find them, they would weigh down their shoes, sometimes with concrete or other things, and they'd throw them into the river so that they would never float back up and be found. Let's see if we can get this all on there. Nope. We had to travel all the way down to our Grandma Dowdle's before we ever set eyes on a corpse. Dad said Mary Alice and I were getting to the age when we could travel on our own. He said it was time we spent a week with Grandma, who was getting on in years. We hadn't seen anything of her since we were tykes. Tykes are like little kids, little toddlers. Being Chicago people, Mother and Dad didn't have a car, and Grandma wasn't on the telephone. They're dumping us on her is what they're doing, Mary Alice said darkly. She suspected that Mother and Dad would take off for a week of fishing up in Wisconsin in our absence. I didn't mind going because we went on the train. The Wabash Railroad's crack bluebird that left Dearborn Station every morning, bound for St. Louis. Grandma lived somewhere in between, in one of those towns the railroad tracks cut in two. People stood out on their porches to see the train go through. So we know that Grandma lives in some little tiny town in between Chicago and St. Louis. And think about it. Joey and Mary Alice, they are 9 and 7, I believe that's what it said, and they're going to travel on the train by themselves. Mary Alice said she couldn't stand the place. For one thing, at Grandma's you had to go outside to the privy. That's like the outhouse. It stood just across from the Cobb house, a tumble-down shed full of stuff left there in Grandpa Dowdle's time. A big old snaggle-toothed tomcat lived in the Cobb house, and as quick as you'd come out of the privy he'd jump at you. Mary Alice hated that. Mary Alice said there was nothing to do and nobody to do it with, so she'd tag after me, though I was 2 years older and a boy. We'd stroll uptown in those first days. It was only a short block of brick buildings, the bank, the insurance agency, Moore's store, and the Coffee Pot Cafe, where the old saloon had stood. Prohibition was on in those days, which meant that selling liquor was against the law, so people made their own beer at home. They still had the tin roofs out over the sidewalk and hitching rails, like where you would hitch up your horses. Most farmers came to town horse-drawn, though there were Fords, and the banker L. J. Weidenbach drove a Hupmobile. It looked like a slow place to us, but that was before they buried Shotgun Cheatham. He might have made it unnoticed all the way to the grave, except for his name. The county seat newspaper didn't want to run an obituary on anybody called Shotgun, but nobody knew any other name for him. This sparked attention from some of the bigger newspapers. One sent in a stringer to nose around the Coffee Pot Cafe for a human interest story, since it was August, a slow month for news. The Coffee Pot was where people went to loaf, talk tall, and swap gossip, so they would go there to tell stories. Mary Alice and I were of some interest when we dropped by because we were kin, so relatives, of Mrs. Dodles, who never set foot in the place. She said she liked to keep herself to herself, which was uphill work in a town like that. In other words, it's a small town, so everybody knows everybody's business. Mary Alice and I carried the tale home that a suspicious type had come off the train in cityfied clothes and a stiff straw hat. He stuck out a mile and was asking around about Shotgun Cheatham, and he was taking notes. Grandma had already heard it on the grapevine that Shotgun was no more, though she wasn't the first person people ran to with news. She wasn't what you'd call a popular woman. Grandpa Dowdall had been well thought of, but he was long gone. That was the day she was working tomatoes on the Black Iron Range. Let's turn our page. Black Iron Range. And her kitchen was hot enough to steam the calendars off the wall. Her sleeves were turned back on her big arms. When she heard the town was apt to fill up with newspaper reporters, her jaw clenched. Presently she said, "I'll tell you what that reporter's after. He wants to get the horse laugh on us because he thinks we're nothing but a bunch of hayseeds and no-count country people. We are, but what business is it of his?" "Who was Shotgun Cheatham, anyway?" Mary Alice asked. "He was just an old reprobate who lived poor and died broke," Grandma said. "Nobody went near him because he smelled like a polecat," which is another name for like a skunk. "He lived in a chicken coop, and now they'll have to burn it down." To change the subject, she said to me, "Here, you stare these tomatoes, and don't let them stick. I've stood in this heat till I'm half cooked myself." I didn't like kitchen work. Yesterday she'd done apple butter, and that hadn't been too bad. She made that outdoors over an open fire, and she'd put pennies in the cauldron to keep it from sticking. Down at the old coffee pot they say Shotgun rode with the James boys. "Which James boys?" Grandma asked. "Jesse James," I said, "and Frank." "They wouldn't have had him," she said. "Anyhow, them Jameses was Missouri people. They were telling the reporter Shotgun Cheatham killed a man and went to the penitentiary." "Several around here done that," Grandma said, "though I don't recall him being out of town any length of time. Who's doing all this talking?" "A real old humped-over lady with buck teeth," Mary Alice said. "Cross-eyed?" Grandma said. "That'd be Effie Wilcox. You'd think she's ugly now. You should have seen her as a girl, and she'd talk you to death. Her tongue's attached in the middle and flaps on both ends. That means she doesn't stop talking." Grandma was over by the screen door for a breath of air. "They said he'd notched his gun in 6 places," I said, pushing my luck. "They say the notches were either for banks that he'd robbed or for sheriffs that he'd shot." "Was that Effie again? Never trust an ugly woman. She's got a grudge against the world," said Grandma, who was no oil painting herself. She fetched up a sigh. "I'll tell you how Shotgun got his name. He wasn't but about 10 years old, and he wanted to go out and shoot quail with a bunch of older boys. He couldn't hit a barn wall from the inside, and he had a sty in one eye. They were out there in a pasture without a quail in sight, but Shotgun got all excited being with the other big boys. He squeezed off around and killed a cow. Down she went. If he'd been aiming at that cow, or at her, she'd have died of old age eventually. The boys took the gun off him, not knowing who he'd plug next. That's how he got the name, and it stuck to him like flypaper. Any girl in town could have outshot him, and that includes me." Grandma jerked a thumb at herself. She kept a 12-gauge double-barreled Winchester Model 21 behind the woodbox, but we figured it had been Grandpa Dowdle's for shooting ducks, and I wasn't no Annie Oakley myself, except with squirrels. Grandma was still at the door fanning her apron. Then, in the same voice, she said, "Looks like we got company. Take them tomatoes off the fire." The stranger was on the porch, and when Mary Alice and I crowded up behind Grandma to see, it was the reporter. He was sharp-faced, and he'd sweated through his hatband. "What's your business?" Grandma said through the screen wire, which was as friendly as she got. "Ma'am, I'm making inquiries about the late Shotgun Cheatham." He shuffled his feet, wanting to get one of them in the door. Then he mopped up under his hat brim with a silk handkerchief. His Masonic ring had a diamond chip in it. "Who sent you to me?" "I'm going door to door, ma'am. You know how you ladies love to talk. Bless your hearts, you'd all talk the hind leg off a mule." Mary Alice and I both stared at that. We figured Grandma might grab up her broom and swat him off the porch. We'd already seen how she could make short work of peddlers, even when they weren't lippy, and tramps didn't seem to mark her fence post. We suspected that you didn't get inside her house even if she knew you. But to our surprise she swept open the screen door and stepped out onto the porch. I followed. So did Mary Alice, once she was sure the snaggle-toothed Tom wasn't lurking around out there waiting to pounce. "You a newspaper reporter?" she said. "Peoria?" It was the flashy clothes, but he looked surprised. "What they been telling you?" "Looks like I got a good story by the tail," he said. "Last of the old Owl Hoot gunslingers goes to a pauper's grave." Pauper means poor. "That kind of angle. Ma'am, I wonder if you could help me flesh out the story some." That means give some details. "Well, I got flesh to spare," Grandma said mildly. "Who's been talking to you?" It was mainly an elderly lady. "Ugly as sin calls herself Wilcox," Grandma said. "She's been in the state hospital for the insane until just here lately. But as a reporter, I guess you nosed that out." Mary Alice nudged me hard, and the reporter's eyes widened. "They tell you how Shotgun come by his name?" "Opinions seem to vary, ma'am." "Ah, well, fame is fleeting," Grandma said. "He got it in the Civil War." The reporter's hand hovered over his breast pocket, where a notepad stuck out. "Ah, yes. Shotgun went right through the war with the Illinois Volunteers, Shiloh in the spring of '62, and he was with U.S. Grant when Vicksburg fell. That's where he got his name. Grant give it to him, in fact. Shotgun didn't hold with government-issue firearms. He shot rebels with his old Remington pump-action that he'd used to kill quail back here at home." Now Mary Alice was yanking on my shirt tail. We knew kids lie all the time, but Grandma was no kid, and she could tell some whoppers. That means big lies. Of course, the reporter had been lied to big time at the cafe, but Grandma's lies were more interesting, even historical. They made Shotgun look better while they left Effie Wilcox in the dust. "He was always a crack shot," she said, winding down. "Come home from the war with a line of medals bigger than his chest." "And yet he died penniless," the reporter said in a thoughtful voice. "Ah, well, he'd sold off them medals and give the money to war widows and orphans." A change crossed the reporter's narrow face. Shotgun had gone from kill-crazy gunslinger to war hero marksman. Philanthropist, even. He fumbled his notepad out and was scribbling. He thought he'd hit pay dirt with Grandma. "It's all a matter of record," she said. "You could look it up." He was ready to write in a new story. Civil War hero handpicked by U.S. Grant called to the great campground in the sky. Something like that. And he never married? "Never did," Grandma said. "He broke Effie Wilcox's heart. She's bitter still, as you can see." "And now he goes to a pauper's grave, with none to mark his passing," the reporter said, which may have been a sample of his writing style. "They tell you that," Grandma said. "They're pulling your leg, sonny. You drop by the coffee pot and tell them you heard that Shotgun's been buried from my house with full honors. He'll spend his last night above ground in my front room, and you're invited." The reporter backed down the porch stairs, staggering under all of his new material. "Much obliged, ma'am," he said. "Happy to help," Grandma said. Mary Alice had turned loose of my shirt tail. What little we knew about grown-ups didn't seem to cover Grandma. She turned on us. "Now, I've got to change my shoes and walk all the way up to the lumber yard in this heat," she said, as if she hadn't brought it all on herself. Up at the lumber yard they'd be knocking together Shotgun Cheatham's coffin and sending the bill to the county, and Grandma had to tell them to bring that